how to resolve conflict, a very significant part of your role as an effective manager. You know, I've found that regardless of how effective you are in your role as a manager with your people skills, it always seems like there are situations that arise where there's conflict. Now, how you resolve that conflict will determine whether you're an average or an exceptional manager. As you consider the problem situations that you're involved in, I challenge you to think about one particular point that I hope you'll always keep in mind, and that's the importance of keeping an open mind. Now, that's a difficult thing to do. You know, we're born with an open mind, but very shortly thereafter it begins to close because of the conditioning that we get. And as a manager, we get conditioned to think in certain ways. It's tough to keep an open mind. One of the best examples of keeping an open mind happened to me recently as I was preparing for a presentation. I had made arrangements with the principal of our primary school or kindergarten class that I wanted to visit. I walked in that day. Now visualize this. I walked up to the board, and put a very small but legible dot on the board. I posed a question. Can any of you tell me what that dot is? What happened? After about 5 seconds, I think every hand in that room was up. And most of them were waving. They're saying, call on me, I'll tell you what it is. So I started going around the room. I think the first one said, that's a star in the sky. Second one, as I recall, said, that's a bug on my dad's windshield. Third one said, that's a telephone pole. I said, a telephone pole? He says, yeah, from the top end. I couldn't believe it. I went around the room. There were 30 different answers. What creativity. What an open mind these kids had. I went immediately from that class to the high school. I wanted a senior class. I had made the same arrangements there. I walked in. I did exactly the same thing. And I posed exactly the same question. What happened there? Just what's happening here. Silence. I couldn't believe it. I asked the question again. Finally, in the back of the room, one of the guys was just beginning to raise his hand, and I saw someone alongside of him just beginning to raise his hand. So I called on him. What did he say? It's a dot on the blackboard. I said, oh, that's good. I didn't want to discourage anybody else. I called on the other one. I said, what do you see? He said, that's a dot on the blackboard. Oh. Think about that, managers. Think about that. We've all been through that educational system. What is there about our educational system that closes our creativity? Now, in solving the tremendous, challenging problem and conflict situations that you come into as a manager, I challenge you to keep an open mind. Here's a very true statement. The amount a person uses his or her intelligence is inversely proportional to the amount of punishment they receive for using it. Think about that, managers. What does that mean to you in terms of how you're interacting with your people and how you respond when they come up with a new or a different or a diverse idea? I challenge you yourself to keep an open mind, and don't punish them for the creative new ideas that they come up with, or they'll not come up with any more. Now, as you think about those conflict situations and resolving the conflict that you experience as a manager, I would suggest that there are several general principles that we can deal with in handling conflict resolution. Principle number one, separate the people from the problem. A difficult thing to do at times, admittedly, but so often I'm asked, Jim, should you be hard or soft as a manager in handling a conflict situation? You know what my answer to that is? Yes. Yes. You can, as a matter of fact, be both soft and hard. You can be soft on the people but hard on the problem. If you as a manager will be careful to separate the people from the problem. You see, I believe you can disagree without being disagreeable if you separate the people from the problem. The second suggestion, you can be reflective. Now, this is particularly helpful when you find somebody who's very emotional, very upset, and you as a manager often have that happen. They come to you, they're all upset. What can you do? You can reflect back to them what you're hearing. I might say, Dan, gee, after you've just spouted off and given me all that, I say, you know, what I hear you saying is, and what do? I simply reflect back what I'm hearing. Now, that doesn't mean that I have to necessarily agree with what Dan is saying, but if I reflect back to him what he's saying, and particularly if it is irrational or emotional, he'll begin to realize that. And it slows down the situation, and it also shows you that I, your manager, understand exactly where you're coming from. Being reflective can be an important technique that you can use as a manager. The third technique, give positive nonverbal feedback. Imagine yourself sitting with an employee that's got a lot of problems and there's a lot of conflict there. If you're sitting there in this type of a posture, it certainly demonstrates something to them quite different than if you were leaning forward and nodding and listening, kind of on the edge of your chair. It says, boy, I really do care. So reflecting the nods, the understanding, the smile, being reflective can all make a big difference in terms of what is being perceived by the other party as you respond to this conflict situation. Number 4, take notes. That's particularly effective when you've got somebody that's particularly upset. Because what does it say to the other party when you're interested enough to be jotting down notes in regard to what they're saying? You can even use that on the telephone. Somebody's ranting and raving on the other end of the line. You say, excuse me, could you slow down just a minute? I want to make sure that I get down all of your concerns. Oh. They start saying, hey, this individual really cares. And all of a sudden, the emotion and the conflict in that environment begins to calm down. Number 5, sometimes respond to hostility and anger with understanding and with questions. Now, I'm not suggesting that as a manager you don't sometimes fight fire with fire. But what I am suggesting is you'll find it's often more effective if you come back with the reverse of what they're showing you. If there's hostility and anger there, and you can come back with kindness, with understanding, and particularly with questions. We as managers really need to use questions more, because questions say, I care about you. I want to understand what's inside you, what your concern is, why you feel upset in this situation, or what the real conflict is. Number 6, beware of the ultimatum. Why do I say beware of the ultimatum? The problem here is that ultimatums tend to back us into a corner. They tend to put us in a position where it's tough for us to save face, or the other party to save face. Many times your role as a manager is going to be to help that other party save face because they have issued some type of an ultimatum. If somebody says, for instance, this is the way it has to be, this is my final offer, immediately you start thinking about what additional information can you throw in here that will help that individual save face as they comfortably back off of the ultimatum that they have provided you. When the other person is hostile or emotionally hurt, express sorrow and empathy. Sorrow and empathy without accepting responsibility. People like to know that you understand, that you hear, that you're empathetic. Now, you may not agree with what they're saying, so you do not necessarily need to accept responsibility for the problem they're perceiving. But them knowing that you care and that you understand makes a big difference in reducing their emotional level. The eighth suggestion, I think I can perhaps best prove with an example. Now, I've been studying each of you, and I'd like to select somebody, if I could, for this experiment. Dave, would you mind if I selected you? Dave, you have any idea what's going to happen next?
Not right now.
Okay. I have in my pocket here 3 cards. I'd like to take them out and show them to you and everyone. We have a yellow card, a blue card, a red card. Dave, which of those cards, now Dave, you got to promise me that you'll be honest in this situation. Which of those cards most appeals to you from a color standpoint?
The red one.
The red one does. He selected the red card. Now, knowing that I was going to use Dave for this particular experiment, I wrote a message to him in the envelope that I pulled it out from. I'd like you to find the message in there, Dave, and if you will, read it to everyone.
On a red piece of paper, because your personality will select red.
You see, people are different. Now think about this experiment. If I would have selected someone else in this room, there are a few of you that may have selected red, but many of you would have selected blue, and some of you would have selected yellow. It is so important that we understand our employees and treat them differently on the basis of their likes and on the basis of their dislikes. So the point of number 8 is people are different, but they're predictably different. One of the ways that you can be effective as a manager in resolving conflict is to think about the questioning process. And how can we be more effective in that questioning process? First of all, why would you ask questions? I would suggest to you, you want to know what the other person wants. And that's the real purpose for asking questions here. Key in on what their needs are. Key in on what their feelings are. Key in on what their thinking is so that you can handle each person differently. Let's, for example, look at some good questions that you might ask. One thing you might say, for instance, is there anything else I should know in regard to this matter? Excellent question. Because you're going to get information that you didn't know how to ask for in any other way. Or you might use the hypothetical question. What if? Or suppose that, and pose a hypothetical situation to them to draw out more of the information that will be helpful in resolving that conflict. Or you might say, you know, if I could wave a magic wand over you in this situation, what would you hope would happen? That'll give you real insight into that conflict situation. Or you might say, why did you say that? I'm curious. I'm interested in what you said. Can you tell me why you said that? And you probe further. And you keep on saying, and you get more information. Because knowledge gives you power as a manager. And you're much more effective in being able to handle that individual when you understand how they're truly feeling and how they're truly thinking. Now, if question asking in a conflict situation is important, question answering also is. And many times, as managers, you'll have questions posed to you. Now, I would suggest in at least 95% of the cases, you're going to answer those questions directly. But as a good manager, there are some alternatives that you have to answering a question directly. Can we brainstorm together here for a minute and try to figure out what else you might do when a direct question is posed to you as a manager in the 5% of the time, perhaps, when you don't answer it directly. What else can you do? What are some options here?
Ask another one back.
There's an excellent response. You can ask another question back, and sometimes, as a manager, that is the best response to a question. You might say something as simple as, gee, why do you ask that? Or perhaps it might be, how would you like me to answer that question? Two good standard questions that can be used anytime a question is posed to you and you're not sure exactly how to answer it. Is there anything else that you can do when a question is asked of you? What are some other alternatives? How about delay? You have that option. You know, that's a good question, and I want to answer it. But you know, in order to answer it, we need to understand this, and you shift over and discuss what needs to be discussed before you turn your attention to that particular problem. Anything else that you can do? How about ask to have the question repeated? There is an excellent standard technique, because I'll tell you what happens normally when you ask to have a question repeated. It normally comes back in a way that's a little bit easier for you to answer. As a matter of fact, it never gets harder, so it's an excellent technique. Anything else that you can do? How about, yes?
Ignore it.
Ignore it. You have the right to ignore the question. That's exactly what I was just going to say. You have the right to be silent. And sometimes the best response to a question is silence. Did you notice what happened when I asked you that question and nobody responded? I mean, first the pressure was on you, but then all of a sudden what happened? It came back up here, and I interrupted him in doing it because I was getting uptight. So you have the opportunity of silence. And you also have the opportunity of not answering that question, with or without an explanation. Although usually, as a manager, in most situations that you're involved in, you want to tell them why you're not answering it. I don't know the answer. Maybe we can find it out. It's confidential information. I think it's an unfair question, whatever the reason might be. But you have all those options in handling the question situation. And the creative manager, again with that open mind, says, I don't necessarily need to answer every question. Sometimes there are better alternatives under the circumstance. Now, in those difficult conflict and problem situations that you face as a manager, you're sometimes going to reach an impasse. And you say, man, I don't know where to go from here. I mean, it just seems like there's no place to go. Let me suggest that there are places to go. Let's consider a couple of them. The first one, whenever an impasse is reached, it's like a train who's stopped. It's very difficult to get that train moving again, isn't it? But once the movement begins, you've got the momentum. And so I would suggest that in this process you consider building momentum. Let's talk about a number of ways that you can do that in the conflict situation. One way is to recap or to summarize. In other words, you can go back on the progress you've made here. Another thing that you could do is to introduce another issue. Perhaps you've stalled on the issue that you're on. Introduce another issue. And what kind of an issue would you want to select? One that you could solve relatively quickly to what? To build that momentum. Momentum is so important when you're in a conflict or a problem situation. Another thing you could do to build momentum is get agreement in principle. Maybe you can't agree on that which you're discussing now. Maybe there's conflict there, but can you get agreement on anything? I mean, I might simply say, Carol, you know, we've had a lot of problems over the years, but we've always been able to work things out, haven't we? Now that's an agreement in principle, and we are both saying yes, and we are building our momentum. Or I might say, you know, this thing is so important that if we can't agree, why don't we find a mutually disinterested third party and help them decide for us in the situation? That's another agreement in principle. Another thing you can do is appeal to an ally. Who do you know that might come into this situation and be able to help bring it to an effective conclusion? Another thing that you can do when you reach an impasse and you want to build momentum is provide a conditional concession. What could you concede to resolve the conflict situation and get something from the other party in return that would help build that momentum and move you along? Another thing you could do is change the people involved in the discussion. Maybe pulling yourself out of it and bringing somebody else in might help greatly. A new perspective opens up different possibilities. A third thing that you can do when you reach an impasse is to express feelings. It's amazing what happens when you allow people to express their feelings. And many times your expressing your feelings may help. We may be in a very difficult situation, and I just say, boy, it's frustrating, isn't it? And you kind of relax and say, yeah, it is. I worked with a professor many, many years ago who traveled the world working with organizations and groups, and he had one simple philosophy. He said, if you want to think clearly, you need to recognize and express your feelings. We need to remember that as managers. Express your feelings and encourage those that are reporting to you, particularly in that conflict situation, to express their feelings. It might be through using empathy. That's a very effective technique. Or you might even use humor in the situation. That can help. There's a fourth thing you can do. When there's a conflict situation, so many times it's effective to reduce it to writing, to illustrate it. Get a piece of paper, maybe a flip chart, and put everything down in writing. You can see where you stand. You can identify the problems. You see, as a manager, we need to realize that writing crystallizes thought. And crystallized thought motivates action. And in this case, it will probably be positive action that will take us to a conclusion of that particular problem. There's a fifth thing that you can do. You can provide a guarantee. Because many times when there's a conflict, when there's a disagreement, when there's a problem, it's because one side is looking at the situation and perceiving it differently, perhaps with a lot greater risk than the other side. In that situation, providing some type of a guarantee under the circumstances can resolve that situation. Another simple way to do it, number 6, is to use a mediator or an arbitrator to mutually agree that we'll use some disinterested third party who could make an effective evaluation and help us be fair in resolving that conflict. Because then it's not me deciding or you deciding, but it's somebody we mutually agreed upon. When you want that win-win environment, I'd much rather do it that way than doing anything else to make sure that it worked out my way, because that's win-win in the situation. There's a 7th option that you have, and that's adding an option when you reach an impasse. Let me illustrate this point with this story. An athletic team that I'm familiar with was negotiating with one of their top players, his agent, and they were $100,000 apart in their negotiations for a 3-year contract. The team was offering $500,000. The player's agent wanted $600,000 per year on the 3-year contract. I thought the team did an interesting thing. They, first of all, asked a question. Why is this player worth $600,000? And then they shut up and listened. The player's agent said he's worth $600,000 because of the time he'll play this year and next year and the year after. And the team thought, and they said, you know, you're right. If he does play that much, he's worth that. So they added an option to the contract, giving him a base salary of $500,000 and adding a bonus that would enable him to get to $600,000 if he played that amount of time. It was a true win-win solution to the problem. We as managers need to remember to have an open mind as we approach every conflict situation. I hope you'll remember as you leave here today about the kindergarten class and the high school class. And quite frankly, I hope you'll have the attitude as a manager, the creative attitude of those kindergarten kids who came up with many different creative ways to solve the problem.